Richard, thank you very much for facilitating that last session. I thought that was great. So everyone, welcome to the start of session 2 of this symposium on project leadership for a changing world. We are fascinatingly running a couple of minutes early, which has to be a record. As we move into the next session, I'd like to say thank you very much for the group of speakers in the first one. I found the conversation particularly fascinating around questions around the changing understanding of the boundary for projects, which really brings up the need for increased systems thinking. Given our multidisciplinarity of projects, this really raises questions around forms of representation, not just inside our projects, where we take the where we're treating just the internal team as our project group, but looking at a broader group of stakeholders. So I'm Julian Pollock. I'm Deputy Director of the John Grill Institute for Project Leadership and Research Director of the School of Project Management. I'll be your chair for session 2 of this symposium. Now, the challenges of a changing world suggest the need for new forms of project leadership, project sponsorship, project governance. In this session, we'll draw on research insights and explore some fascinating future directions. With us, we have 3 leading experts in the area. We have Professor Nathalie Drouin from University de Quebec, Montreal, and also KHEOPS. We have Professor Ray Levitt from Blackhorn Ventures, and who you've already met in our previous session, you've got Professor Richard Badham, who has recently joined us at the University of Sydney. So what I will now do is ask each of our panelists to provide us with a quick 3-minute overview of your research and thoughts related to project leadership in a changing world. Nathalie, if I could start with you.
Yes, thanks very much, Julian. I'm very pleased to be with you today to discuss the challenges of a changing world, and more specifically to share with you my thoughts on balanced leadership. Ralph Muller, Shankar Shankaran, and myself, we have published papers and more recently a book that will be available in December, so pretty soon, on the concept of balanced leadership. To explain this concept, which is a little bit complicated, but I'll try to make it, to explain it in a very simple manner, let me say a few words on leadership theories. Leadership theories tend to either focus on the personality or the leadership style of the leader. Basically, it is a leadership style of the project manager, or we can also call him vertical leader. Or leadership theories also look at the leadership processes emerging from the team. And this is what the previous panel mentioned about, sharing the leadership, distributed leadership. And basically what it is a group of process in which leadership is distributed among team members. But project practice shows that leadership authority alternates between leadership by team members and leadership by project managers in a dynamic way over the project life cycle. So it led us to identify a third form of leadership in projects, that is horizontal leadership. So what is a leadership, horizontal leadership? It is really a leadership executed by a team member upon nomination by the project manager and upon acceptance by this team member to act as a leader on a specific task. So if we come back to balanced leadership, it is how leadership switches between vertical and horizontal leaders. If I explain it in an academic way, it is the dynamic, situation-dependent transition of leadership authority from the project manager to a project team member and back again to project manager to contribute to project success. The switching of leadership authority is based naturally on trust that the vertical leader places on the horizontal leader. So I trust this person to lead, as well as the evaluation of the horizontal leader's competencies. Does this horizontal leader has the competency to lead? The situation begins when a team member or team members, because it could also be team members, accept the role of horizontal leader, and it ends when the authority is back to the project leader. In addition to this switch of leadership, we also identify in our research a socio-cognitive space. So it is a space as a coordinating mechanism between project managers and team members. This space has three components. The first one is empowerment. The second one is self-management. And the third one is shared mental models. So we need these three components as project manager to determine the teams and the project manager's understanding of who can and will become an horizontal leader at any point in time during the project. So to create this space, you have to ask yourself three questions as project manager. What is the level of empowerment a project manager is ready to allow or could allow to a team member or to the team members? What is the level of self-management capabilities by the team? Thus, this team member has the capability to lead on a specific task. And finally, to create this space of switching leadership, what is the level of shared mental models? How team members understand their task? Do they have the skills to do their task? And are they willing to act as horizontal leaders? So I stop here, and I hope it was clear. But if there's one thing that you can remember of balanced leadership, it is switching the leadership to vertical leaders, the project manager, or to a specific team member, or to the team members, which are basically the horizontal leaders.
Nathalie,
so
thank you.
I handed it to you now.
Nathalie, thank you very much. That was a great introduction to balanced leadership and a roadmap for some of the conditions that make it possible. I'd encourage all our audience to use the chat to pose questions. We will have a chance to respond to these slightly later on in this session. At this point, I'd like to ask Ray, how are the requirements of our changing world affecting the pressures, the conditions, the needs for leadership of projects?
Thank you to Julian and Jennifer for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'd like to make clear that my background on project leadership comes from two directions, primarily from the civil engineering construction direction, where I spent most of my career either working on construction projects in the trades and the management, and then most of my career as an academic in construction management within civil engineering departments at MIT and Stanford. And then the second area of my sort of insights and views about project management comes from running an executive program on strategy execution using ideas from project management, which brought me into contact with people in software like Salesforce.com who were doing agile development, and all the way on the other extreme with people like Lockheed and other aerospace companies, Dassault, that were doing what I would call systems integration, which is an even more rigorous form of project management than we see on big construction projects with a lot of change control and configuration management and so on. So one of the things that I can comment on, because the last 5 years after retiring from Stanford, I've been working in venture capital with startups that are bringing technology to project management, is that it's really the case that construction, along with other industries that have mobile workers, have been accused of being laggards with respect to productivity and productivity gain driven by innovation. There were good reasons for it. Mobile workers were not able to use computers in the same way that desk-bound or office-bound or even factory floor people could use technology, because you couldn't carry a laptop around a job site or a service truck, and if you did, it wasn't connected to anything. So several converging trends have unleashed thousands of new technologies that support leadership in project management. So these include smart mobile devices, which is literally like a more powerful and more friendly IBM PC in your pocket. It's also connected to the cloud, which gives access to vast data storage and computation capabilities, even beyond what an old IBM mainframe could do. Low-cost wireless sensors that are cheap to install and very easy to operate. Democratized artificial intelligence in the last few years, where all of the web-based platforms will provide platforms for speech recognition, image interpretation, natural language processing. And so a huge data stream and series of applications that exploit that digitized data have been unleashed on the project world. And leaders of projects are now being literally bombarded by thousands of startups offering to digitize various workflows that have been paper-based or less heavily digitized in the past in these emerging technology industries like construction, like service tech, like other industries that have mobile workers, and even in factories and e-commerce data centers and so on. And so, you know, the last thing that's made this very attractive to highly cyclical industries like construction that could never really afford to have a lot of capital investment and a lot of debt because they're so cyclical and they can't sustain that, is subscription-based software that can be scaled up and down according to your needs, where you don't have to buy a mainframe, you don't have to buy priests in white coats in a glass temple to manage the IT, and you can just subscribe to cloud-based software, pay for it with a credit card and use it as you need it. And so how do project leaders cope with this barrage? And what we see are what I would call death by pilots for startups, where project managers who are tech forward look at, you know, some shiny object and decide, I'll try that on my project. But they've never really created a plan either for their own organization or for the startup to scale that technology if it indeed is successful. And so this is, again, it's death by pilots for the startups because they're startup pilots, which are often either free or very low price, never scale up. And for the companies that try them out on projects, they're not really beneficial because they don't scale across the enterprise. And so, you know, we've developed a thesis around this through our investments in multiple of these kinds of companies that are trying to pitch to project leaders in construction and manufacturing and service tech and so on, to say, before you agree to do a project, get a buy-in for one or more senior operations people in your organization about what criteria and what sort of target values for those criteria would meet the threshold where you would judge it to be a success and therefore try to roll it out. And then get a commitment from them for the way in which they would scale the solution if it works well on the pilot project across a region or even across a whole enterprise when it's been met. And so this kind of discipline for outside-in innovation is something that has been executed very well on some of the big UK projects like Crossrail and High Speed Rail 2 and so on. Some of the big Australian projects have adopted similar kind of approaches. Jennifer knows a lot about this from her work in the UK. And so I think it greatly enhances the probability of seeing long-term benefits in the way we can run projects and the way we can decentralize management of projects in a confident way, to build on what Nathalie has just said. And I'll say more about that later across different stages of the project lifecycle. But, you know, my recent experience leads me to think that we have to get a lot more disciplined about how we try out technologies on projects.
Right.
So I'll stop there, Julian. And
thank you very much. That was great. And I do want to come back to the life cycle question, which you just raised. So hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that in a minute. Ray, thank you very much for that. Richard, could I pass over to you? What are your thoughts about the changing demands on project leadership? And do you have a response to what's been said so far?
Well, first of all, I have to thank Ray, because I wouldn't have known how to unmute because somebody muted me. So thank you very much, Ray, for me being able to avoid it. And interesting, I think I'm going to look at three little issues, right? So one is change, one's politics, and one, which will sound surprising, is poetry. What we've got from Ray and Nathalie is what we expect and what we need, which is advice about how to run projects. Now, from the change perspective, the interesting thing is that we actually don't get to do what we know should be done. The change problem, there's an old Irish joke about cars stopping on the side of the road and asking a farmer, what's the way to Cork? And the farmer says, if I was going to get to Cork, I wouldn't start from here. And I think mostly in our projects, the problem is that we don't have what it is that we're told we're having. And three key gaps for me is, one is a leadership gap, another one is a knowing doing gap, and another one is a power gap. And the leadership gap is that we all know that leadership is really important, but when we look at what happens in our projects, quite often it's not the leadership, it's the management that dominates. And we all know that there are things in principle we should do, but when it comes into practice about how you apply those principles, it's often very difficult. And the other one is my favorite, which is the power gap, which is that how many of us have jobs that we're meant to do, but we're never given the resources and the time in order to get them done. So the change problem to me, which is set up, is that how do we actually battle those gaps and overcome them? And the politics issue is, it's like, there's a lot of us, and I think in a way it's kind of bred into us in our rational world, is that we like to think that the real job is the technical job. Just get rid of this politics, social stuff, and I'll get back to what we really want to do. Whereas once you get into complexity in leadership, the real job is dealing with people, dealing with politics, dealing with power. If we know that there are embedded barriers to getting done what we want to have done, and the success of projects and changes over time kind of reinforce the fact that there are those problems, being able to play positive politics, being a political entrepreneur, being able to build coalitions, to be resilient, to come back, to go beneath the surface of the technical and address the emotional, cultural, political dimensions is a key part of the skills of a leadership. So quite often politics is not talked about openly. It's seen as a bad thing, but when we have actually had a look at the research on politics and power, there is a huge amount out there, and it's really valuable and it's really important. So one of my main points would be increasing your political capabilities as a leader to address these gaps. The final one, which I goes on the poetry, is that somebody I met who was just a wonderful human being who died just about a year ago, James March, one of the most, he was described as the guru's guru of management studies. And he said in leadership, there's plumbing and there's poetry. And in the plumbing, there's the very important task that a good manager is meant to do, which is take the knowledge that we know, apply the rules, get things done, make sure that things happen in a relatively secure, predictable kind of a way, but it's based on the knowledge that we know. But he said, once you go into leadership, once you really think about leadership, he said we go into the era of what he would like to call poetry. Now, in order to put a bit of structure around that fuzzy concept, there were two issues. One is that in our lives, we often don't know what it is we're pursuing until we start pursuing it. So how do you as a leader know that, yes, you've got to have goals and purposes, but it emerges and develops over time? And what do you do as a leader and a human being and in the project to deal with that movable feast? And the second one is a reflective one that actually, as you get older, you tend to reflect on more, but is actually important for people younger as well, which is, in the words of James March, we live in a world in which victory is elusive and virtue is not reliably rewarded. You know you can do exactly the right things in the projects and still it goes wrong. Or somebody else does everything wrong and through accident, somehow it works out right. So how do we find meaning in a world in which we know that those conditions are there? And I think that finding of meaning is is really crucial. And what the point he makes is that, yes, we're driven by outcomes, and that's important as a motivational device. But if we live our life just on the basis of outcomes, we're liable to be very disappointed and frustrated at the end. It's the journey is the thing. How do you have relationships with people, find elegance, find poise, find delight in what it is that you and others are doing along the way is an important part of leadership at the same time as dealing with the instrumental factors. So those are my main things, is that Nathalie and Ray know a lot more about projects than I ever will. And they probably can run projects in ways better than I ever be able to. But from the change perspective, it's acknowledging the barriers, surfacing and raising politics, and dealing with some of these. In a way, the poetry of leadership sounds like this silly add-on, but if you actually go into cafes and bars and at the home and people are reflecting on their projects, it's those kinds of issues that concern people. And I think we ought to be surfacing and addressing those as much as we can. So thanks very much, Julian.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, I'd like to go on to a few different questions. I'd encourage you all to keep your answers relatively brief because we've got quite a few questions from the audience. And I've got a couple of questions of myself, but if I could start with Nathalie. One question from our audience is, do you see the future of projects focused around a balanced leadership extending to leaders, perhaps unofficial leaders outside the project team, such as community stakeholders, some of whom we might want to involve in the process through co-creation, co-evolution, and co-sustaining value for a better society?
I love this question. That's a very good one, because in our research, we really focus on the project and the project team. So what we studied, it's really, you know, the interaction or the switching between the project manager and the project teams. But with that question, it brings me to say that this is another research project that I would like to develop, because I conduct research with, and I studied mega project leaders. And one important thing to these mega project leaders was the external stakeholders. And they saw the engagement, not the management, but the engagement of external stakeholders as key success factors for the success of the project. So it was really, you know, engaging the external stakeholders. So now looking at balanced leadership, I didn't study that, but it might be interesting to look at. Is it possible to transit or to give the leadership or to allow leadership to communities in order to create value with the project? And I hope so, because this is part of building a partnership, not just engaging, but for me, stakeholder is managing. You have to manage stakeholders, you have to engage stakeholders, and you also have to create a partnership. So if you create this partnership for the success of the mega project or the infrastructure projects, it is also important to be able to give leadership on specific tasks to these communities. So that's a very good question. I'm going to stop here because you say, you know, as a professor and teacher, we can speak and speak. So I'm going to stop here. But just a short answer to that, unfortunately, we didn't study that, but it is a very interesting topic.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ray, Nathalie was just talking around the importance of engaging stakeholders. Now, the stakeholders that we're engaging within our projects are going to be different at different stages of the life cycle. Could you tell us a little bit about how leadership demands change across the life cycle?
Yes, I will, and I'll draw heavily on work by our late colleague, Peter Morris, who passed away recently. who published a paper based on his experience with major steel mills and the communication system in Cairo and other projects he worked on over the years, which he called matrix swing. And he argued that there are very predictable phases of projects where you need different kinds of leadership and different kinds of coordination mechanisms. And so, you know, Agile, this relates very much to what Nathalie was talking about before, the horizontal versus vertical management, but it also goes beyond that, I think. And the argument is that in the conceptual design stage of projects, you're really brainstorming with relatively high-level experts who can forecast the implications, the detailed implications of conceptual design decisions based on their experience, and can almost resolve those just by their own experience. And so small teams working very quickly, a great example of that is NASA created something they call Team X, where they transformed the development of planetary missions from a multi-month process to a series of a few half-day meetings but it has to be high-level experts who have a lot of experience, again, who can just interact horizontally using their own expertise and come up with the overall configuration of a project. So that phase needs to be done in a decentralized way with facilitation by a project manager, but really relying very heavily on the expertise of the team. Then you get into a detailed design. Now, I'm not even going to talk about the political phase of the project that Richard alluded to and getting stakeholders aligned and so on, and then the financing, but just the execution of the project. So conceptual design, and then you've got detailed design, which operates in a very hierarchical way with decentralized teams of experts who look upwards for advice from more experienced senior people in their discipline. So that tends to be more vertical management. And, you know, with coordination by design review meetings, not real time, you know, expert to expert, and a lot of background work done in between these meetings. And then you get to the construction or implementation or manufacturing phase of a big project. And now it's really highly decentralized down to these teams that have been scoped appropriately and told to do their part of the project. And you're relying on the expertise of each of the specialists to do their part of the project that's been conceived previously. And then finally, when you get up to you know, startup testing and turnover to operation, you have to reintegrate the project in a vertical way, but not by functional discipline, more by system. And so now you're testing systems that might cut across multiple disciplines. And in fact, these distinctions are so severe that many large companies in the US who do these mega projects actually deliberately switch out the project manager for people who have facilitation skills in the conceptual design stage, technical integration skills during the detailed design stage, you know, to look for change coordination and interface clashes and things like this. And then to decentralized teams of contractors who become part of the project team or departments of a big organization who execute parts of the project. And then a reintegration by a project manager who really understands system integration and system interfaces. And so you're moving from, you know, very agile at the beginning to more hierarchical, then to more decentralized teams to do the detailed design. But within those teams, there's hierarchy. And then at the end, more systems integration across disciplines, which is like cross-functional teams all the time. And so what we see in organizations that are very agile, just to talk about agile versus traditional leadership, if I may take another minute or two, Julian.
Go ahead.
You know, actually one of the best books on agile teams that I've ever read was published by the US Department of Defense Office of the Secretary, and it's called Power to the Edge. And it's about how they set up the training and operation of special forces teams of the sort that captured Osama bin Laden, or that are given a high-level directive and left to work out all the details by their experience and training and rehearsal of different scenarios. But they talk about having shared global awareness and having self-synchronization within the team. So very decentralized execution and basically relying on expert people. You cannot do agile development with novices because they're not able to create a commander's intent, a high-level intent, to a detailed set of requirements of what they're supposed to do. So organizations like Salesforce would not hire novices. They would expire They would hire experienced developers who had been trained in other companies and were already quite expert. And the solutions they were developing were simple enough that you could tell a programmer, build a module so that a customer can check if their sales team has met its quota for the month. And they don't need any more specification than that. The team knows how to implement that. What was really different and interesting, we looked at Intuit, the software company that makes QuickBooks and other TurboTax in the US for filing tax returns. When they moved from traditional software to cloud software, they wanted to embed sort of cross-selling inside each of the modules. So when you were using QuickBooks, it would try and sell you TurboTax and so on. And the marketing requirements for what those web pages should look like could not be expressed in a one-line user requirement, like, capture Osama bin Laden dead or alive. It had to be spelled out in 30-page description. So even when they thought they were doing it in an agile way, they were still using very detailed specifications. So I think John Doerr's book about objectives and key results, where he talks about these OKRs as the basis for leadership of projects at Intel and other places, is another really interesting resource for thinking about when, as a project manager, you should operate in a more agile versus decentralized way, and how to use high-level objectives to inspire motivated teams to be creative and come up with good solutions.
Okay, Ray, thank you very much. There was a lot in that comment. Richard, I've got a question for you. Partly reflecting on what Ray's been discussing around changing leadership demands through the life cycle. How does the power dynamic play out, and what is the role of project leadership in cutting across silos?
I think one of the tensions with Agile is that we're not agile enough to become agile, right? So it's the paradox is that we're talking to organizations that often aren't agile with an idea about what agile can be. And there are leading examples of where that's done well. But when you take the leading example into a context where the people are not thinking that way, it's the chicken and egg. They need to be agile to appreciate agile in a way. So part of the politics is kind of getting yourself ready for that. Now, for me, there's kind of three capabilities. It's reasonable, cosmopolitan, and seriously playful. And the reasonable part is, do not expect people to behave rationally. It's irrational to do so. So when you're pursuing agile and the people are not behaving in an agile fashion, or they've called it agile and they're doing something else, one thing is to get incredibly annoyed because they don't understand my theory of agile. The other one is to say, of course, how do I try and move them in a way into something? And the cosmopolitan part is that it's across these silos is I don't know about you, but we all have our prejudices. You come from marketing, you hate finance. You come from finance, you hate HR. If you're a customer, you hate the deliverers hate the customers, So all our different perceptions. The cosmopolitan view is, can you actually appreciate that you live in a world where other people think differently to you, and that's okay. Draw on it, create it. Sounds kind of easier than it is in practice. And the seriously playful part is this idea that we can be committed to our projects and yet at the same time realize that things may not work out. And there's something there about being agile is that, it's a little bit like learning. When you do true learning, it can be painful. If you do agile, there can be conflicts and tensions that you don't expect. The seriously playful part is pursue your goals, but actually have a little bit of lightness to the way in which you're experimenting. So that's very general, but in terms of cutting across silos, it's kind of adopting that reasonable, cosmopolitan, playful stance in bringing people together is what I would emphasize. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Now we've got a lot of questions coming through the chat, and there's no way, unfortunately, we're going to be able to get through all of them. But Nathalie, perhaps I could pass this question to you. How are our definitions of project success impacting on our understanding of leadership? It seems like we've got a general transition within the discipline from just focusing on deliverables to looking at the broader context and outcomes. Is this affecting how we're seeing leadership?
It certainly, it certainly affects the way you balance leadership. Because depending of how do you define the project success? In some situation, the project success is probably connected to the value you create or the social value you create for a community. Maybe you are overcast. Maybe it took you more time to deliver this project. But if you create value, social value for a community, so it could be, this is a way to define the project success. And how do you get there? And how do you balance your leadership? How do you give, the opportunity to team members or project manager to balance the leadership is also managing your risk attached to delivering this project. And if I may, I would like to come back to the comment Ray mentioned. I don't know if I answered the question well, but Ray mentioned something very interesting, and it popped in my head. When you have, when you have to deliver a mega project, you have a constellation of firms working on the project to deliver this project. And you have a governance network, a governance structure to put in place to make sure that everybody will deliver what they have to deliver in order to have to deliver the project successfully. But if you use the concept of balanced leadership, it is managing your risk. It is saying, as the leader of this mega project, when do I have to decide who's gonna lead on what? And is this, for example, this firm that will deliver more value in order to have a successful project, I should pass the leadership. So this is on, in our study, we look at balanced leadership in project within organization. But if you look at mega project, you can also create this space, this social cognitive space to make the mechanism work well and select the best firm or the best people within these firms that should make the decision on a specific task. And this is difficult because when you are leading, when you are a leader of mega project, this is deciding that I'll give the power to someone else to deliver his parts. And how do you control that? So that's what I'm going to stop here now. I can say more, but I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thank you. And as one final question, which I'll leave open to any of our panelists to answer, should we be training our politicians to be project leaders? We have politicians work in an environment with clear stakeholders, outcomes which they should be working to achieve, fixed election timeframes. They could be developing on coordinating experts across diverse agendas. Is there a position here for political training in project leadership?
Absolutely, yes. In the formative stages of projects, when you're talking about mega projects that have impacts on communities, regions, and even national economies. And on geopolitics, you look at something like the Baku to Tbilisi pipeline or the Nord Stream pipeline, which gives Russia a stranglehold on Europe's gas supplies. You absolutely have to be a politician. And so again, the people who are conceiving these projects are grand scale entrepreneurs, in the project world, trying to form these coalitions through sort of a series of investments that have been compared to real options. You spend a certain amount of money to let yourself get to the next stage, and then you put in more money to de-risk it in another way. It's a lot like venture investing, by the way. You do exactly the same thing, but here you're doing it on a regional or global scale. And if you don't have the kind of political skills and sensitivities that Richard was talking about, you're unlikely to be able to ram it through, no matter how attractive the benefits may appear to be.
Okay. Please, no, add a final thought, Richard.
A study years ago on Edison, was absolutely brilliant with this, because Edison, we think he invented the light bulb, but it was actually, he didn't invent the light bulb at all. He just made it a bit cheaper, and it had to be, you had to get rid of gas lighting, and you had to set up a network. You had to deal with local councils and politicians and PR. So he was actually a system builder. And to be a system builder, you've got to be a good politician. So I think from the other side, as I think the questioner was hinting as well, do politicians have to be a bit more informed about project leadership? Would actually be something quite important. How to get there, I'm not quite sure. But I think definitely project leaders have to be more like politicians, but some of the good aspects of politicians, not the bad.
I wish our politicians in the US could have better collaboration skills, you know, for holding up an infrastructure program for 3 months and then caving at the end. And
what I can say about this question, the answer is yes. Yes, they have to be trained. They have to be sensitive about what is project leadership, because they are part of this project leadership.
Thank you very much. So at this point, I'd like to thank all our panelists for your time and insight. I hope everyone else in the audience has enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. We've got a few things coming up next. So in a minute, I'll hand over to Jennifer to wrap up our first sessions. And then after that, we'll move into breakout sessions. So everyone, I don't think you have an opportunity to directly thank Nathalie, Ray, and Richard for their presentation, but wish them the best. And oh no, you can put something in the chat, of course. So put something in the chat expressing how much you've enjoyed it. I certainly have had a great time, and I look forward to continuing some of these conversations with you a bit later today in one of our breakout sessions. So thank you very much. And at this point, I will hand back to Jennifer.
Thank you very much to all.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Nathalie and Ray, for joining us. I've been scribbling notes in the background. It's been really fascinating to hear your contributions, and thank you to Julian and Richard also for being on the panel. And nice to see the thank yous coming through on the chat. That's a good thought, Julian. So I wanted to ask you to join us in thanking the keynote speakers. We've got an opportunity now to continue the conversation, and we're going to move in a moment from this webinar into a more interactive format. I just wanted to give you some information about the logistics and just to bring the keynote sessions to an end. And so if we can move on to the next slide. I think earlier in the morning I showed this slide around the kinds of themes that we have around project leadership, project models and digital transformation, organizational dynamics of projects, and projects for sustainable and resilient futures. And we will have some breakout groups that represent these themes in a moment. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the broad cast of collaborators that are behind the scenes here. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah, just a couple of quick notices that there's an opportunity if you're a leading academic in the audience to join the school. And of course, there are opportunities for industry partners to collaborate with ourselves and with our partners around the world in this area of project studies, if that's an area of interest to you. Can we move on to the next slide? So just the logistics for the next sessions. So the rest of this morning is going to be in a Zoom meeting, and then the evening session will be back in this webinar. And so if you want to go and take a coffee, this is a good half hour to do that in. If you would like to go and join our colleagues in one of these breakout sessions and have a bit more of a discussion on some of these topic areas, please do go into the Zoom meeting. And I know that Margaret has put the direct link to that in chat. there will be someone in the main room who can help you if you have the ability to go to the breakout room of your choice and to move across breakout rooms. But there will be a slide in the main room that gives you the instructions on how to do that. And one of our colleagues is there if you have any difficulties doing that. At 11:30, we will bring you back into the main room in the Zoom meeting for a session on research developments. And I'm really excited that we've got a short list of 4 researchers who are going to talk about in very short bursts. And I think they have 3 minutes to talk about their research, and then we have some opportunity to ask them questions. And so that session will start at 11:30, but in the Zoom meeting. So it really falls to me to kind of close the webinar for now. Depending on your time zone, if you can join us in the evening session, we would love to see you again in the evening. But please do join us in the Zoom meeting for the more interactive part of this morning. Thank you.